Hello, tonight's story is titled, How Did Men Impress Women in the Middle Ages? If listening to stories like this helps you relax and fall asleep, don't hesitate to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, if you're ready, turn off the lights and create a peaceful atmosphere for yourself. With the sound of a crackling fireplace in the background, let's begin this captivating story. In the quiet stretches of time that marked the centuries between the late 11th and the tip of the 15th century, human social habits underwent a sequence of gradual but unremarkable tendencies, in particular in the domain of interpersonal members of the family, which integrated, among other sluggish changing customs, the style where guys sought the attention, realization, and eventual companionship of women. These centuries, commonly grouped under the general designation of the Middle Ages or medieval interval, present countless, though on the whole understated, insights into the quiet intricacies of gendered interactions, in particular within the subject of what modern-day scholars and commentators would time period courtship, though it will have to be noted that such terminology is a quite up-to-date imposition upon a much more delicate and diverse set of social rituals. This primary part ambitions not to explore grand stories of chivalric conquest, nor tales of impassioned romance, but instead to softly unfurl the understated and procedural social stipulations below which the act of impressing a lady could be, and often used to be, tried, more commonly with the aid of men, although circumstances of feminine-initiated interest though less quite often documented it occur in equally unremarkable approaches. The reader, or in this case the listener, is prompted to approach the fabric now, not as a way to excitement or intrigue, but with an attitude attuned to gradual unfolding, sluggish reflection, and passive reception of long-standing but as a rule, overlooked details that incorporate the material of medieval day-to-day life. Let us begin not with a dramatic introduction, but rather with a quiet cataloguing of the broader structures that ruled male behavior within this context, starting first with the role of sophistication, then of occupation, followed by way of land tenure, nearby governance, ecclesiastical have an impact on, and familial expectation. Each of these performed a measurable function in picking out how a man might, or could not, proceed in making his curiosity in a woman recognized, and more importantly, socially applicable. Classification distinctions, and their quiet have an impact on courtship opportunities. The medieval period. The divisions of social class were not purely formal, however deeply woven into the rhythms and repetitions of daily existence. Guys have been born into classification positions, and barring great occasions, reminiscent of navy valor followed with the aid of royal desire, or, more rarely, clerical development leading to ecclesiastical vigor remained inside these structures. During their lives, these category positions shaped nearly every facet of human interaction, including the manner in which one would procedure the procedure of impressing or expressing curiosity in a girl. For instance, a person of noble beginning or minor gentry would doubtless not interact in the same manner or language of admiration as a villain, cotter, or freeman. Alternatively, the courtly traditions influenced by means of chivalric literature and troubadour poetry, themselves often ritualized and unrealistic, would body the formalized expressions of admiration from men within the upper social spheres. These expressions included the gifting of modest tokens, the writing of heavily stylized verses, or participation in routines such as feasts or seasonal gatherings, where a person might be seen performing acts of controlled talents similar to falconry, harp playing, or chess in full view of knowledge, romantic pursuits. Nonetheless, it is foremost to notice that such actions had been mostly much less emotionally driven than they have been strategically stimulated, influenced by loved ones, alliances, landholdings, and concerns of dowry. In distinction, guys of the courses whose lives had been regulated more strictly with the aid of agricultural schedules and manorial responsibilities, engaged in quieter and not more ceremonial means of attraction. A man would, over the path of several planting and harvesting seasons, make his curiosity recognized through steady helpfulness, participation in shared labor tasks, or modest verbal expressions made for the period of times of approved social mingling, reminiscent of church galas, market days, or communal ale brewing routine. These expressions have been much less formalized and lacked the veneer of poetic sophistication, but were mostly extra-enduring, formed through familiarity, proximity, and shared difficulty. Occupational identity as a secondary but enduring effector occupation of a man, at the same time on the whole byproduct of his classification, nonetheless imposed a precise set of behavioral expectations and constraints. This intended that two men of an identical type heritage, however differing trades, say, a blacksmith and a cooper, would likely have extraordinary avenues wherein they would search to demonstrate attraction. The blacksmith, whose work concerned the rhythmic clanging of metallic and the managed use of fireside, could emerge as recognized for force, reliability, and productive potential. A cooper, whose skill in crafting barrels required designated awareness to measurement and becoming, possibly considered for patience and carefulness. These traits, whilst not explicitly a part of courtship habits, nevertheless contributed to the quiet formation of impressions over time. Distinct trades carried with them a modest status. Bakers, for example, supplied an integral provider and had been mostly granted positions of common visibility in the community. Bakers, especially these associated with monastic bakeries or better towns, would commonly engage with female shoppers instantly. Although these interactions have been bounded via norms of politeness and propriety, in contrast, tanners, whose work was once related to robust odors and the dealing with of animal hides, have been seen with some social hesitation, and as a consequence most likely discovered themselves less often concerned in public-facing courtship. Rituals, among the more sedentary and clerical professions, similar to notaries or scribes, interaction with women was once extra limited via the character of the work itself. However, the possession of literacy, however normal, quite often conferred a quiet sort of admiration. Chiefly in city settings, the place the written word was increasingly tied to authorized and industrial authority. Some documents advocate that minor scribes on occasion composed verses or devotional texts as gifts, although the reception of such efforts used to be variable and more, most of the time than now not, functioned as a gesture of piety as a substitute, than flirtation. 3. Land tenure and the gradual accumulation of respectability in the feudal economic system of a lot of medieval Europe. Land used to be no longer in simple terms a resource, however, an emblem of reliability and repute. Even in its most modest type, a man who held land, be it a small parcel of arable soil or a slightly better conserving with rights of fashioned, was regarded to be in possession of stability, which used to be a valued trait in the quiet calculus of marital consideration. This connection between land tenure and courtship conduct used to be most obviously mirrored in the mundane but persistent use of the phrase "able to provide," which appears in several extant authorized and familial files. Among villains and freemen, the capability to manage a small holding was some of the constant methods a person could display suitability for marriage. At the same time, such management did not always contain romantic or performative gestures. The consistency of seasonal labor, the care of animals, the restore of boundary markers, and the prompt payment of tasks to the manor or parish all served to build a quiet popularity. In this context, impressing a lady was normally synonymous with impressing her loved ones, principally fathers and older brothers, whose assessments were based extra on visible patterns of reliability than on allure or eloquence. That is valued, and noting that among tenant farmers and smallholders, interactions with advantage partners have been usually facilitated by spatial proximity. The shared use of wells, ovens, and grazing lands created possibilities for expanded, if repetitive, contact. These encounters were mainly ruled with the aid of community norms and commentary, which restrained the use of overt gestures or declarations, but nevertheless allowed for a sluggish and regular accumulation of familiarity. This lengthy kind approach to enchantment, where attention was earned over the path of months or years, stands not like state-of-the-art expectations of immediacy and assertion, for they have an impact on of ecclesiastical oversight and moral legislation. The course of the medieval period, the Church played a said and sustained function in shaping public morality, in particular in issues concerning marriage, propriety, and gendered behavior. It's main to understand that the Church's influence used to be now not basically doctrinal, but also procedural, and its many branches, parish priests, bishops, abbots, and synodal courts worked in quiet coordination to oversee his overview and repeatedly preclude behaviors deemed inappropriate. Men searching to provoke women have been accordingly fielded to a kind of ecclesiastical expectations, the public expression of desire was ordinarily restrained by using codes of modesty and decorum. A lot of that had been drawn from sermons, confession manuals, and canon legislation. Direct speech was discouraged. Metaphor and euphemism were preferred. Public dancing, though every now and then permitted for the period of festivals, was monitored for impropriety. Hand-holding or reward, principally external, the formal betrothal method, would be puzzled. The outcome was once a cultural environment wherein male courtship conduct became encoded in oblique varieties, shared prayers, participation in church constructing efforts, or displays of quiet devotion. In some communities, certainly in areas, virtually monastic facilities, guys would additionally try to demonstrate their enchantment by way of religious engagement, corresponding to singing in the choir, collaborating in processions, or memorizing parts of liturgical textual content, even as these actions weren't consistently immediately linked to courtship. Their performance could serve to raise one's perceived moral personality, which in flip would subtly increase one's social standing and eligibility. Familial and communal mediation in the courtship procedural titly. The role of the family, improved loved ones, and neighborhood at enormous are not able to be overpassed when examining the ways by which men in the center a while attempted to impress or entice the awareness of females. Not like in present-day individualistic frameworks, medieval relationships have been often mediated via collective structures. Parental involvement used to be expected, and in lots of cases, preparations had been initiated or negotiated, now not by way of the members themselves, but through representatives or intermediaries, who could include a father, an uncle, or in some cases, a neighborhood official. Inside these frameworks, a person's character was once probably evaluated, established on cumulative know-how. How he behaved for the period of communal workdays, whether he was punctual at Mass, how he interacted with elders, and how he dealt with minor disputes, even whatever his pursuits, because the tidiness of his clothes, the regularity of his hair trimming, or the cleanliness of his boots would be viewed through these observing, often silently, over long periods of time. Communal gatherings, such as feast days, harvest festivals, and May Day celebrations, offered structured possibilities for interaction. Nevertheless, these occasions, even as festive, had been probably overseen by using elders, reeves, or bailiffs, who ensured propriety was once maintained. For that reason, male makes an attempt at impressing women for the duration of these movements had been marked more by means of cautious moderation than by way of overt expression. A good-timed praise, a shared dance within the bounds of subculture, or the delivering of a flower or token, these had been long established, but they were not dramatic. They usually hardly ever carried on-the-spot consequences. Conclusion of Part 1 AS. We conclude this introductory element of our examination. It is fundamental to admire that the ways in which men tried to provoke women within the Middle Ages were not defined by using grandeur, flamboyance, or instantaneous outcome. Rather, they were marked with the aid of graduality, through modest repetition, and through a deep attunement to the social constructions that guided behavior, whether through land administration, quiet consistency, devout observance, or unobtrusive participation in group existence. The approaches of medieval courtship were in general mundane and generally free from the heightened emotion or personal autonomy that signify modern romantic narratives. In the following sections, we can continue this examination through turning our concentration to extra unique case studies, together with the role of letters and written types, the impact of guild participation, the modest arts of functional present giving, and the seasonal rhythms that shaped interplay. Each and every matter can be approached with the identical calm, measured tone, offering further detail into this quiet and typically overlooked corner of history. As we gently transition from the broader frameworks that governed male courtship habits within the medieval interval, we now flip to the more designated, although nonetheless quietly practiced, ways of communique and expression that slowly came into use throughout precise areas and courses. In detailed, this section will tackle the sophisticated and often uneventful approaches in which letters, written tokens, and small items had been employed by means of men as a part of their efforts to galvanize or respectfully strategy women. These practices, though now not universally popular, gradually emerged in localized settings and amongst unique segments of the population, most primarily among the many literate, the clerically affiliated, and the mercantile classes. Unlike the exaggerated stories determined in chivalric literature, the place knights composed florid odes to unattainable ladies. The precise use of writing in courtship was once, more commonly, restrained, formulaic, and guided by ecclesiastical norms and legal proprieties. The narrative that follows will examine these written and material gestures in 5 slow setting up sections. 1. The emergence of common letter-writing practices. 2. The role of scribes and intermediaries. 3. The restrained but fantastic use of poetic forms for the perform of symbolic tokens. And 5. The soft rules surrounding courtship exchanges. Each subtopic can be approached with a peaceful sense of order, supplying minimal emotional variant and focusing as a substitute on the smooth rhythm of social repetition, bureaucratic system, and minor but power-old patterns. The emergence of basic letter-writing practices in courtship contexts. The written word, although increasingly utilized for the period of the High and Late Middle while, was once nonetheless now not a common medium for verbal exchange. Literacy remained erratically dispensed, with clerics and concrete dwellers more likely to possess functional reading and writing abilities than rural peasants or unlettered craftsmen. As such, using private letters in courtship used to be mostly restricted to special populations, particularly those who had either got ecclesiastical guideline, these affiliated with service provider guilds, or those residing in towns and cities. The place written contracts, invoices, and correspondence had ended up part of daily existence. Letters, written with the intent, or the mild implication, of romantic curiosity tended to follow a subdued and formal structure. Openings have been courteous, typically invoking divine blessing or seasonal references. For instance, one would begin a letter with phrases comparable to "May just this notice find you in the grace of our Lord and the warmness of spring's early light." Such phrasings were not always individual, but had been regarded decorous and proper. The body of the letter would by and large contain indistinct references to the sender's character, industriousness, or endurance. Direct statements of affection have been rare, and when present, were in general veiled in metaphor or framed as admiration for advantage rather than wish. Due to the fact writing used to be no longer viewed as a spontaneous or informal act, such letters were in most cases drafted cautiously, with concentration paid to penmanship, orthography, and tone. The system of composing a courtship letter might take a number of days, particularly for these of restrained literacy, who could depend on memorized formulae or pre-written items discovered in letter manuals. These manuals, such as the Ars Dictaminis, furnished templates for various types of correspondence, including supplication, apology, and respectful admiration. It's primary to note that few such letters survive in these days, due partially to their ephemeral nature and the dearth of archival renovation for private substances. 2. The function of scribes, clerics, and intermediaries, given the somewhat low cost of male literacy across so much of medieval Europe, especially in rural and scaled-down type populations. Many guys relied on scribes or semi-literate intermediaries to compose or give messages. These scribes, usually clerks, chaplains, or notaries, carried out their work quietly, normally for modest fee in coin, meals, or future favors. The involvement of a third social gathering in such private matters may show up intrusive through latest requirements, but in the context of medieval society, it was once generally seen as an anticipated and honorable step. A person might, for illustration, process the local parish clerk to request assistance in composing a modest letter to the daughter of a reeve or miller. The scribe would then produce a brief "be aware," in general only some sentences in size, carefully phrased to restrict impropriety. In many cases, the scribe would also be liable for providing the letter or making certain its discreet transmission by way of trusted channels. It used to be no longer distinctive for a letter to pass through two or extra fingers before achieving its meant recipient, extra decreasing the likelihood of emotional candor or spontaneous expression. This mediated method placed giant emphasis on tone and social framing. For instance, the letter could reference shared participation in a latest harvest or religious procession, followed by way of a normal statement, such as "I maintain in esteem your tender demeanor and advantage, which is spoken of good in the village." Such wording conveyed cautious admiration, whilst remaining within the bounds of propriety. Responses, in the event that they were composed at all, had been in a similar fashion, oblique, and in general filtered. by means of maternal figures or different feminine loved ones. In urban centers, where guild buildings supported a broader category of literate artisans and apprentices, the use of intermediaries grew to be slightly more different. In some cases, fellow guild members could vouch for a suitor's habits or deliver letters as a part of their activities' errands. This reliance on communal validation extra underscores the deeply social, alternatively than confidential, nature of medieval courtship communications. 3. Poetic types and the quiet use of versine areas influenced via the troubadour lifestyle to southern France, northern Italy, and ingredients of the Iberian Peninsula poetry on occasion served as a car for male courtship expression. However, nearly all of these compositions had been carried out or shared publicly and didn't always mirror person intent. In fact, many saw referred to as love poems functioned as workouts in literary convention alternatively than records of private feeling. However, in unique confined circles, specifically among minor nobles, pupils at cathedral schools, and clerical officials, short verses were generally composed and shared in exclusive. Though these two adhered to formulaic constructions, topics often included admiration for chastity, reward of moderate temperament, or reflections on the virtues of constancy and loyalty. Long-established metaphors integrated the lily purity, the falcon the aristocracy, and the window symbolizing unattainability. These metaphors had been recycled on the whole, and their repetition created a style of calming predictability in the poetic panorama. It was now not amazing for men to copy such verses from present manuscripts, or to adapt recognized traces to regional contexts. For example, a line praising a girl's grace probably altered somewhat, to reference her addiction of attending vespers or weaving by way of candlelight. These small modifications allowed for personal contact without deviating from accepted norms, but at the same time, state-of-the-art audiences could assume such poetry as impassioned. It is most important to consider that medieval audiences normally interpreted verse as rhetorical display instead than emotional confession. The purpose was once to demonstrate refinement, literacy, and composure traits valued with the aid of households and communities more than sentiment or originality. IV. Tokens and the dat means of small gifts passed, the written word, an additional quiet avenue wherein guys attempted to precise interest or admiration was through the supplying of tokens, more tangible objects that carried symbolic, which means, however, posed little threat of scandal or disapproval. These presents were modest through design and integrated items corresponding to ribbons, sprigs of herbs, woven bracelets, spindle whorls, or hand-carved objects fabricated from bone or wooden dot. The decision of such items was once rarely unintentional. A twig of rosemary, for example, was once more commonly associated with remembrance. A carefully polished pebble, located closer circulate, probably interpreted as a sign of attention and thoughtfulness. In city settings, a person could feat a small brooch or metallic charm, typically bearing a easy inscription corresponding to amor vincit, or memento. These inscriptions had been on the whole in Latin, or the regional vernacular, and employed largely famous phrases drawn from ecclesiastical or literary sources. The exchange of tokens on the whole took location in liminal areas, not during grand routine, but in short moments between labor and prayer, or in the course of transitional periods, corresponding to twilight walks dwelling from the fields, or quiet conversations close a market stall. Considering overt gifting was discouraged external of formal betrothal, these tokens were probably accompanied by silence or, at most, a short explanation comparable to on your preserving or as a token of the day. In lots of circumstances, women would not write away well-known receipt of such presents, primarily if others were gift. Instead, the gesture would be recorded mentally and weighed over time, contributing to a sluggish, accumulative judgment of the giver's character and intentions. In contrast to contemporary ideas of romantic reward-giving, which most often search to provoke a reaction, medieval present exchanges have been designed to signal steadiness, intention, and compatibility. V. Regulations and restraints surrounding courtship exchanges. To conclude this section, we have to flip briefly to the more than a few laws each, formal and informal, that shaped and restricted using letters, poems, and items within the context of male courtship. These laws weren't always codified in written legislation, however, have been enforced via social statement. ecclesiastical sermons, and local custom. Many parishes, above all within the 13th and 14th centuries, issued normal reminders during Lent, an introduction about the importance of modesty, the avoidance of worldly entanglements, and the dangers of untimely affection. These reminders did not limit courtship per se. However, they framed it as a system that should be approached with solemnity, self-restraint, and familial input. Guys had been encouraged to seek the information of elders before initiating contact, and to avoid any act that would intend confusion of coronary heart or unnecessary stirring of the senses. Guilds and town councils also commonly intervened. In distinct cases, records continue to exist of fines issued to guys who dispatched overly ahead messages or gave gifts viewed inappropriate in worth or implication. These documents advocate a quiet but steady monitoring of conduct, driven by issues over social harmony and the safety of women's reputations. Much more subtly, ladies themselves, more often than not, exercised social restraint, using long periods of non-response or neutral reply as a way of regulating awareness. On this way, the method of impressing a woman would prolong no longer over days or even weeks. However, over seasons, with each small conversation serving as a part of a much better and deliberately gradual evaluation. Conclusion of section 2. As we draw this second part to a close, we return as soon as once more to the overarching theme of persistence and process. The use of letters, poetic lines, and symbolic tokens in medieval male courtship was marked not by spontaneity or emotional display, but with the aid of slow deliberation, cautious presentation, and the expectation of quiet perseverance. These ways, employed by guys throughout various areas and courses, shaped a secondary layer of communica much less seen than public rituals, but no less ruled via communal norms and structures. In the subsequent section, we can explore the position of seasonal rhythms and agricultural calendars in shaping opportunities for courtship, analyzing how fairs, work cycles, and weather patterns subtly determined the timing and structure of male attempts to provoke ladies. As earlier then, our PC will remain tender, our focal point certain, and our tone intentionally calm. Within the sluggish unfolding of the medieval year, marked now not with the aid of clocks or calendars as we all know them today, but rather by way of the quiet succession of seasonal labors, ecclesiastical festivals, and refined atmospheric shifts, the lives of guys and ladies were ordered in line with a routine and largely predictable rhythm. Inside this carefully paced cycle, the act of courtship, by no means urgent, under no circumstances overly direct, observed its situation, now not as a specified and dramatic recreation, however, as certainly one of many pursuits, features of communal existence, gently interwoven with tasks of planting, harvesting, gazing, and resting. This part will evaluate how medieval guys, searching for to precise their interest or establish reference to women, navigated the restrained and incredibly structured opportunities presented by the agricultural calendar and liturgical year. As earlier then, the intent of this exploration is not to excite or inspire, but to assuage, to sluggish, and to accompany the listener by means of a gradual journey of quiet working out. We shall keep in mind 5 segments. 1. The final tempo of the agrarian year. 2. Durations of extended social interaction. 3. Communal labor as a courtship surroundings. 4. Competition days and their authorized gestures. And 5. The quieting effect of wintry weather. Every of these might be discussed with cautious repetition and slight elaboration, avoiding depth and emotional variant for the period OFI, the general tempo of the agrarian era across a lot of medieval Europe. Certainly in rural areas, lifestyles used to be governed much less through personal ambition and more by collective necessity. The agrarian YR, formed through environmental stipulations and long headquartered customized, supplied the foundational rhythm round which all different pursuits, including essentially the most modest attempts at romantic courtship, were organized. Men and females didn't make plans independently of the land. As an alternative, their days were allotted consistent with the wishes of the soil, the well-being of livestock, and the timing of communal responsibilities. The 12 months commenced quietly. In the early spring, fields have been ready, tools have been inspected, and seed was once distributed. In these early months, when the earth remained smooth but no longer yet warm, labor took priority over amusement, and opportunities for casual interplay remained minimal. A person probably located as he plowed, as he led oxen with quiet instructions, or as he repaired a fence with deliberate steadiness. These observations have been hardly ever interpreted in a romantic feel, but over time they would make contributions to a girl's or her family's gradual evaluation of his diligence. Summer time introduced with it extended sunlight hours, but in addition greater demand. The hay harvest, adopted by using the gathering of grains and the maintenance of backyard plots, absorbed a lot of the group's energy. Yet it was once for the period of these months, because of longer hours and moderately at ease supervision, that brief conversations could occur throughout water breaks, close the sides of fields, or whilst going for walks to and from far-off plots of land. These moments, though transient and heavily bounded through decorum, allowed for the sluggish formation of social familiarity. Autumn marked the closing of agricultural efforts. The grain used to be saved, the animals had been introduced in, and preparations for winter began. It was once during this season that discussions of betrothal were most quite often initiated. Now not always by way of the participants involved, but by families, reeves, or neighborhood monks. These preparations have been usually awarded as proposals for mutual benefit and steadiness, rather than as responses to expressions of affection. Nevertheless, the pattern continued, 12 months after 12 months, supplying a quiet framework within which guys could hope, with adequate consistency and propriety, to be favorably observed. Intervals of multiplied social interaction inside the calendar. Though much of medieval lifestyles used to be founded on work and devout observance, there were precise occasions for the period of the 12 months when extended social interplay used to be not most effective, permitted however, expected. These periods, almost always tied to ecclesiastical festivals or agricultural milestones, supplied structured yet moderate possibilities for courtship-associated conduct. Amongst these had been Shrovetide, May Day, Lammas, and the post-harvest feasts in Michaelmas and Martinmas. In the course of Shrovetide, which preceded the Lenten fast, modest video games and limited dancing have been generally allowed. In specified parishes, plays had been performed by using clerks or townsfolk, and food was shared communally. Guys could use this get-together to offer compliments, or to support with serving bread or cider, gestures which, while small, could be interpreted as signs of attentiveness. May Just Day, more distinguished in England, and materials of northern France, featured modest processions and the gathering of greenery. In some villages, pairs of guys and females had been selected as May Just King and May Just Queen, a ritualized and generally symbolic role. Participation in such movements used to be viewed a sign of youthful eligibility. However, any overt displays of affection were discouraged by using clerics, who generally issued reminders concerning the sanctity of chastity and the risks of unguarded merriment. Harvest celebrations, principally these held at Michaelmas in late September, marked the end of intensive area labor. These gatherings often incorporated communal ingredients, the consumption of ale, and the singing of usual songs. Whilst intently monitored by way of older community individuals, such activities allowed for restrained dancing and low gift-giving. A person could carve a spoon, recite a short rhyme, or present a garland of wheat as a gesture of goodwill. The response to such choices used to be generally reserved, but, over time, such gestures could lead to more critical issues. 3. Communal labor as an atmosphere for familiar rituals. Modern notions of courtship most of the time emphasize solitude and privateness. Medieval practices were more on the whole embedded inside communal settings. Some of the activities, but quietly giant, of those was once collective labor. This included now not most effective fieldwork, but also duties comparable to repairing roads, cleaning ditches, mending roofs, and tending to animals. For the period of seasonal drives, for the duration of such hobbies, men and ladies worked aspect with the aid of partners continually as companions, but most of the time within earshot. These shared endeavors supplied possibilities for statement, consistency, and moderate help. A person who continuously carried water for the group, offered a serving to hand with a cussed cartwheel, or remained calm for the period of climate would slowly turn out to be considered as a risk-free figure. These qualities, observed over months or years, have been most likely extra influential than any single act of allure. Moreover, the regularity of such labor allowed for quiet repetition, a greeting repeated over several mornings, a shared giggle, at a predictable mishap, or a comment in regards to the pleasant of barley, all such interactions contributed to a tapestry of low-degree familiarity, which might serve as the basis for eventual, if modest, romantic curiosity. 4. Festival days and their authorized gestures. Medieval religious festivals, celebrated throughout the year, provided no longer handist non-secular enrichment, but also regulated events for celebration, nowadays, which incorporated no longer most effective the important feasts of Christmas and Easter, but in addition, numerous saints' days and neighborhood patronal galas functioned as temporal openings within an otherwise event's existence. On such days, guys and ladies dressed of their finer garments attended longer lots, and mainly remained in or around the churchyard for expanded durations. At the same time, overt courtship was once discouraged. There existed small allowances for interaction. A person would present to hold a stool for an elderly relative of an expertise, curiosity, or aid regulate a borrowed cloak. These moves, consistently minor, were implemented beneath the gaze of the neighborhood, which acted as a silent witness to all lawsuits. In regions the place miracle performs, or processions, were carried out, guys might take on the role of saints or apostles. The modest prestige associated with such roles on occasion conferred a measure of quiet admiration, particularly when a man displayed memorization talents, patience for the period of lengthy rehearsals, or composure throughout the actual performance. Such features have been valued, now not for his or her spectacle, however, for their implied moral steadiness. Moreover, for the period of the blessing of fields, the lighting of candles, or the ritual censing of livestock, guys and females participated, collectively, regularly, in processional order. These movements, whilst not romantic in intent, accredited shared presence and coordinated motion, experiences that, when repeated, created a sense of soft mutual consciousness. The quieting have an effect on of iciness and the pause in courtship. Sooner or later, as the year grew to become another time and iciness descended more commonly early, and with little warning, many courtship gestures had been suspended. Now, not out of lack of curiosity, however, due to environmental and sensible constraints, travel became more difficult, gatherings much less common, and communal labor slowed. Houses remained closed for longer portions of the day, and contributors withdrew into smaller home routines, punctuated by using prayers, minor repairs, and storytelling. During this time, men regularly reflected on the 12 months' efforts, deliberate minor improvements to their dwellings or holdings, and sought steerage from older relatives. It was also in the course of these months that families might begin to discuss, in hushed tones, the potential for future preparations. These discussions, held by using hearthlight or in the corners of alehouses, were not dramatic in tone but marked by cautious optimism and repeated references to reliability, propriety, and shared belief. It used to be not distinguished for a person to begin carving a small present, possibly a picket brooch, or a spoon for the period of these lengthy evenings, to be awarded, if the moment appeared proper, for the duration of one of the vital upcoming spring festivals. In this means, courtship didn't cease for the duration of wintry weather, however, as an alternative entered a quieter, more preparatory segment, outlined by modest hopes and gradual intentions. Conclusion of Section 3. As this 0.33 section concludes, it becomes more and more evident that the methods wherein guys attempted to provoke ladies within the middle a while have been governed no longer handist by social expectations, familial oversight, or ecclesiastical steerage, but in addition, by means of the gradual, deliberate percent of the usual world itself. The seasons, each and every with their own tasks and boundaries, shaped the timing, process, and content material of courtship behaviors in methods that have been rarely dramatic, but deeply regular. The subsequent part will continue this smooth exploration through inspecting the role of guilds, apprenticeships, and the structured environment of urban life in shaping courtship practices among craftsmen and tradesmen. As earlier then, we will be able to proceed with care, element, and a relaxed dedication to readability. In the increasingly structured environments of medieval cities, the place cobbled lanes, picket workshops, and market stalls defined the daily action of a growing population. The method of courtship assumed varieties that, whilst nonetheless restrained and cautious, mirrored the impact of emerging associations, primarily the guilds. These businesses, developed steadily and maintained with a slow however chronic consistency, offered both a framework of economic order and a procedure of quiet social regulation for male craftsmen, be they apprentices, journeymen, or established masters. Participation in a guild decided no longer best authentic status, but also, through levels, the appropriate methods and timing in which they could seek to interact. In courtship conduct, this fourth part will evaluate how the lifetime of an urban tradesman used to be formed by using the layered buildings of guild hierarchy, communal duty, and occupational duty, and how these causes influenced the subdued and repetitive patterns of attempting to provoke females. As in previous sections, we will face up to the temptation to dramatize, and as an alternative, proceed with soft remark, calm description, and sluggish elaboration. The discussion will unfold across 5 sections. 1. The structure and performance of guild membership to the daily routines of apprentices and their constrained freedoms. 3. The role of public popularity and moral conduct. 4 occasions of regulated socializing and guild feasts. And 5. The impact of master craftsmen and the concerns of marriage within the guild framework. Structure and function of guild membership. Guilds in the medieval period served, now not simplest as monetary cooperatives, but additionally as instruments of social order, fashioned to keep watch over the practices, prices, coaching, and requirements of quite a lot of trades. Guilds developed a tripartite hierarchy consisting of apprentices, journeymen, and masters. Each in every degree carried with it no longer only a suite of tasks, but also an expected mode of public conduct, which integrated the manner in which a person might, or would now not, interact in behavior that perhaps interpreted as courtship. 4. The apprentice, in most cases a boy or younger man of between 12 and 16 years. The point of interest remained firmly on discipline, observation, and obedience. Apprentices weren't inspired to pursue romantic pursuits, and in many guilds, written statutes or verbal customs explicitly forbade apprentices from seeking female manufacturer. Such regulations had been supposed not to stifle feeling, however, to continue the apprentice's energy and attention for the long, slow method of finding out his craft. Journeymen, probably older and having accomplished their time period of apprenticeship, had been afforded rather extra freedom. However, even their social conduct was once monitored through guild elders and masters. Journeymen have been anticipated to search steady employment, reveal sobriety, and attend meetings and feast days in appropriate costume. Simplest, after years of regular conduct and contribution to the guild, would a journeyman be viewed eligible for marriage, and even then, not without additional oversight. Masters people, who had submitted a qualifying piece of labor and got approval, have been traditionally married men, or have been motivated to marry soon after attaining their position. Marriage was now not viewed as an individual indulgence, however, as a realistic step toward beginning a household workshop. The wife of a grasp typically played a function in bookkeeping, consumer family members, or the supervision of more youthful apprentices. Thus, marriage was once viewed as part of the trade itself, instead than a distinctive or emotional venture. 2. Daily routines of apprentices and the obstacles on courtship. The lifetime of an apprentice was marked by using regularity, restraint, and typical correction, most likely dwelling within the household of his grasp. The apprentice rose earlier than Donand, engaged in a collection of duties that ranged from sweeping, flooring, and sharpening instruments to fetching materials and aiding in the simpler stages of construction. Days were long, foods had been modest, and conversations had been limited to matters of the trade. Given this structured atmosphere, possibilities for courtship were rare and, when they did arise, have been modest in both form and intent. An apprentice would alternate glances or transient greetings with a lady from the neighboring household, or with a seller's daughter out there square. These exchanges, though minimal, might recur over many months, steadily forming a quiet attention on all sides. However, any further motions such as initiating conversation or providing a small token was once mostly discouraged, and in some households punished. In infrequent situations, a master would allow an older apprentice to attend a public event, comparable to a Saints' Day procession or a guild-subsidized feast. Even then, habits was once closely watched. An apprentice who drew too much awareness, both by means of boastfulness or flirtation, could be mentioned to the guild and face reprimand or dismissal. As such, apprentices realized to specific themselves, if at all, via indirect manner regular helpfulness, quiet reliability, and neat appearance. It is most important to notice that these patterns, at the same time restrictive, were not perceived as merciless. Rather, they have been understood as essential phases in a slow course towards adulthood, during which emotional restraint was considered a virtue and romantic impulses were to be converted, over time, into intentions compatible for marriage. 3. Public repute and the significance of moral conduct in city settings. The place persons lived in nearer proximity and reputations have been more simply found. A person's ethical behavior played a gigantic position in his eligibility for courtship, an eventual marriage. Gossip, at the same time discouraged by using clergy, served as an casual regulatory approach, and stories of a person's temperance, honesty, or diligence would flow into broadly, shaping perceptions long before any direct romantic engagement took situation. Guys who hoped to marry or, even to the approach of establishing contact, had been advised to build a stable reputation over time. This could comprise attending mass normally, collaborating in processions without incident, paying guild dues swiftly, and maintaining a tidy shopfront. In some towns, guild contributors had been expected to put on detailed clothes, such as belts or tunics bearing their craft's brand, for the period of public events. Adherence to such codes used to be no longer only a subject of pleasure, however, of signaling one's self-discipline and integration into the communal material. Negative behavior, in contrast, was once quickly remembered. A single drunken outburst, a overlooked tithe, or a rumor of dishonesty could extend a man's possibilities of discovering an associate for a few seasons or longer. In this sense, impressing a woman was once not often a subject of isolated action. However, instead, the accumulation of years of constant, observable habits. It was once also normal in many cities for women's families to inquire discreetly into a person's habits earlier than permitting informal courtship to proceed. In such cases, the opinion of a guild elder, a parish priest, or a revered shopkeeper might weigh heavily in the deliberations. As a consequence, courtship used to be no longer seen as an act of passion, however, as a cautious negotiation between a man's public personality and his perceived potential for loved one's leadership. 4. Regulated socializing and guild feast. Everyday interactions were marked with the aid of formality. Guilds did present structured events for regulated socializing. Chief among these have been the guild feasts, held on the feast day of the customer saint related to the exchange. These feasts, although modest in scale compared to noble banquets, featured shared meals, music, prayers, and formal toasts. They were frequently attended by way of members of the guild, their households, and typically prospective spouses or community figures dotted such gatherings. Guys possibly authorized to communicate in brief with females, above all those of marriageable age whose households had been recognized to the guild. These conversations have been rarely exclusive, and more commonly passed off beneath the watchful gaze of masters, senior household, or parish clerks. The subject matters of discussion have been constrained to impartial issues, whether meals, exchange items, or the client saint's virtues. Any expression of affection was once implied by way of courtesy, awareness, or a well-timed praise related to craftsmanship or manners. It was once not distinctive for a person to convey a small gift to this sort of feaster: cautiously carved comb, a length of dyed ribbon, or a candy preserved in honey. These items were provided in a restrained and respectful manner, accompanied by way of phrases corresponding to a token of my craft, or a small remembrance for the feast. Acceptance did an assurance, extra interaction, but it surely was once in most cases noticeable as a favorable sign if the present used to be now not back. The rhythm of those feasts, taking place annually or semi-annually, supposed that the method of courtship used to be commonly stretched over lengthy intervals, with each interplay serving as a small step in a higher, slowly establishing sequence. V. Grasp craftsmen, family formation, and guild-sanctioned marriages. Among those who had reached the rank of grasp, marriage was once now not most effective, permissible however, usually encouraged. A grasp used to be anticipated to preserve a family ready of aiding apprentices, producing items, and contributing to town's economic system. As such, the resolution of a spouse used to be approached, now not completely as an individual subject, however, as a realistic and communal selection. more often than not involving the opinions of fellow masters, guild officers, and generally civic authorities. Many guilds required that a potential bride be of professional lineage, capable of managing a household, and aware of the rhythms of the exchange. In some cities, daughters of fellow craftsmen have been viewed excellent fits, as such unions reinforced guild unity and ensured that the wife would realize the demands of the occupation. Proposals had been rarely surprising. Rather, they emerged from a series of sluggish interactions, shared feast attendance, mutual buddies, and favorable reviews. Once interest had been expressed, usually by means of a mediator, the approach of negotiation started out. Discussions inquisitive about the dowry, the transfer of tools or property, the housing arrangement, and the longer-term function of the bride inside the workshop. Weddings, after they occurred, had been modest affairs, customarily held within the parish church, adopted through a meal both in the guild hall or the couple's new house. There was little emphasis on romance in the contemporary experience. Instead, the wedding used to be framed as the construction of a stable, God-fearing unit of creation, ruled by way of activities, supported via group, and sustained by way of mutual duty. Conclusion of Section 4 We conclude this fourth section. The sample stays consistent. The act of impressing a lady in the medieval city's surroundings was once formed no longer by means of emotion, novelty, or spontaneity, but by using careful participation in structured methods. The guilds, apprenticeships, and controlled customs of city existence created a surroundings wherein courtship unfolded as a procedure of duty, remark, and slow accumulation of trust. In the ultimate component of this series, we can evaluate forgotten, bureaucratic tactics related to betrothal, marriage contracts, and regional document ordaining an exploration of the forms and permissions that, even as more commonly overpassed, quietly held the machinery of medieval love and union in motion. As we carry this series to a quiet and measured conclusion, we shift our awareness to a site regularly considered peripheral, however correctly imperative to the sluggish formation of marital unions within the medieval period: the bureaucratic approaches that accompanied, supported, and recorded the formalization of betrothal and marriage. These approaches, generally carried out in predictable settings, such because the parish sacristy, the manorial court docket, or the town registry, lacked ceremony or ardor, however, offered a safe framework inside which intentions could be expressed, arrangements tested, and unions slowly introduced into reputable attention, rather than scenes of romance or drama. What follows is a peaceful, methodical exploration of the mechanisms, both ecclesiastical and secular, by which love, or as a minimum commitment, used to be gradually documented, by way of examination of betrothal agreements, bans, dowry preparations, witness attestations, and notarial documents. We can conclude our learn of medieval courtship in a fashion becoming to the overall tone, with steadiness, procedural clarity, and a respect for sluggish moving social order. This fifth part will unfold via 5 add-ons. 1. The function and structure of betrothal contracts. 2. The reading of the bans and public detect intervals. 3. The function of witnesses and community, consent, for property, dowry, and legal switch protocols. And 5. The long-term position of document trading in the upkeep of marital legitimacy. Betrothal, contracts, preliminary agreements, and mutual intention. The approach of courtship in medieval society did not traditionally culminate in an impulsive notion, nor in a surprising ceremony. As an alternative, it transitioned, particularly slowly, into a betrothal agreement of formalized figuring out that a marriage would, in due direction, be entered into. These agreements have been mainly drafted orally, however, over time commenced to be recorded in writing, specifically in city settings or among landholding families, identified variously as sponsalia, dispensatio, or, more effortlessly, a promise to marry. The betrothal was a legal declaration made through each parties, regularly with the presence of at the least 2 witnesses, and usually within the presence of a priest or neighborhood notary. The tone of those agreements was restrained and formulaic. Common phrasing included statements such as, "I, Geoffrey, son of Thomas, do promise to take as wife Margaret, daughter of Adam, when the time shall come, as is fitting and lawful, before God and these witnesses." The contract would comprise common phrases akin to an approximate timeline for the marriage ceremony. acknowledgement of any current tasks, and stipulations for dissolution within the occasion of unforeseen impediments. Some betrothals were conditional, area to approval by means of elders, fee of a portion of a dowry, or completion of a alternate apprenticeship. It was no longer uncommon for such agreements to exist in a liminal state, neither completely binding nor comfortably dissolved, lasting for a lot of months or even years. For the duration of this time, the couple would remain formally separate, with minimal contact, however more and more well known by way of the neighborhood as intended companions. These arrangements furnished a steady center, floor between uncertainty and formal union. 2. The studying of bans and public notifications. The intention to marry had been agreed upon both by means of exclusive contract or communal figuring out. The next procedural step ordinarily involved the reading of the bans, a convention instituted broadly with the aid of the 13th century and mandated by the Lateran Council of 1215. The bans functioned as a public announcement of the imminent marriage, designed to allow for objections, make sure transparency, and prevent unions that violated ecclesiastical legislation. The bans have been read aloud, in most cases through the parish priest, on 3 consecutive Sundays in the course of the main Mass. The phrasing remained constant and impersonal. If anybody is aware of rationale or simply impediment why these two must not be joined in holy matrimony, let them now declare it. The names of the meant couple, their places of dwelling, and many times their mums and dads' names would be included. The atmosphere for the duration of the reading was once not emotional, however administrative, and individuals of the congregation hardly ever reacted until a professional objection used to be identified. Most bans handed without incident, nevertheless, will have to a member of the neighborhood carry a hindrance reminiscent of an undisclosed previous betrothal, a blood relationship inside prohibited degrees, or in fantastic vow the marriage could be delayed pending investigation. In some cases, the objection proved unfounded. In others, it resulted in dissolution of the proposed union. The repeated nature of the bans ensured that folks who could have been absent 1 week would still have opportunity to listen to and respond. The method was gradual via design, reflecting the Church's dedication to cautious and public discernment. For the couple involved, it served as a regular affirmation that their union was once fitting, step by way of sluggish step, a subject of collective consciousness. 3. Witnesses and the position of group. Consent, a tremendous feature of medieval marriage, was its dependence upon communal potential and validation. At the same time, canon legislation emphasized mutual consent. Between the events, the realistic enforcement of that consent relied closely on witnesses. In both betrothal and marriage ceremonies, the presence of as a minimum 2, and typically more, observers used to be essential, no longer in basic terms as authorized requirement, however, as social guarantee. Witnesses would comprise family individuals, neighbors, guild acquaintances, or members of the parish. Their role was no longer dramatic. They didn't provide speeches or wear certain clothes. Alternatively, they stood quietly, listened carefully, and, if called upon, tested what they'd seen and heard. Their presence gave the occasion its legitimacy and allowed it to be remembered safely should disputes come up in future years. In cases where no priest was once to be had, or where a couple married external, the Church effectively witnessed. Alternative vows would still be regarded valid beneath ecclesiastical law, though it would later require formal blessing. This pliability mirrored the Church's pragmatic method to human relationships, peculiarly in rural or warfare-affected areas. Community consent was also expressed through passive statement. If a pair used to be visible to be spending time collectively, following a betrothal, if they were stated via neighbors as spoken for, or if they had been seated collectively at feasts, these indicators contributed to an arising social consensus. In this way, courtship progressively modified into marriage, not via unexpected declarations, but by way of the sluggish accumulation of shared realization. IV, property, dowry, and legal transfer protocols. Marriage, within the medieval interval, used to be now not solely a religious or emotional union. It used to be additionally, and might be more peculiarly, a monetary partnership. As such, the transfer of property, goods, or land played a crucial function in the bureaucratic preparation for union. These transactions were not normally massive in scale, but they had been normally cautiously recorded. chiefly in urban facilities and amongst landholding families. The dowry contribution by the bride's loved ones might encompass coin, tools, farm animals, fabric, or home items. Its reason was once to assist in the institution of a family and to furnish the spouse with some measure of safety. In some regions, a component of the dowry would be reclaimed by means of the bride's family if the wedding ended up front. This condition used to be most likely detailed in writing, utilizing phrases reminiscent of "to be again and entire" if the union be dissolved before the harvest of the 2d12 months. In exchange, the groom or his loved ones would provide a dower, promise of property or earnings to be made available to the bride in widowhood. Dower rights varied broadly, but have been by and large guaranteed in formal writing, witnessed and oftentimes sealed with the aid of the regional notary or manorial courtroom. These arrangements, though financial in nature, were understood to reflect and give a boost to mutual responsibility. They were done without pageantry, mainly in small rooms adjoining to churches or within the higher chambers of resorts. Members spoke in subdued tones, recorded names carefully, and established details by using oath or mark. In this setting, impressing a woman grew to be synonymous with supplying a stable ledger, report maintaining, and the upkeep of marital legitimacience. A wedding had been solemnized, either through church blessing or secular realization. The ultimate layer of bureaucratic interaction commenced, the lengthy term renovation of records. In ecclesiastical parishes, books had been saved, noting baptisms, marriages, and burials. In towns, registers have been maintained via notaries, who logged contracts, disputes, and occasionally marital terms. In rural areas, manorial rolls many times integrated brief notes of marriages, especially when landholdings have been concerned. These documents were not stored for sentimental functions, but to be certain legitimacy, inheritance, succession, and authorized standing most likely depended on proof of lawful marriage. A person claiming his spouse's dowry, a widow searching for her dower, or children pursuing their inheritance all needed entry to such documentation. The tone of these records used to be neutral and administrative. A usual entry might learn, on the feast of St. John, within the 12 months of our Lord 1379, John, son of Alric, was once wed to Margaret, daughter of Gamel, in the presence of Robert the smith and Father Elias. No additional detail used to be required. The record did not seize emotion. Nevertheless, it verified a truth. Over time, these records shaped a quiet archive of human unions. Most of that had been unremarkable, constant, and socially affirmed. They allowed communities to function, families to plan, and church courts to arbitrate with self-belief. On this manner, the bureaucracy of marriage unassuming and slow-moving grew to become one of the enduring expressions of commitment in the medieval world. Conclusion of Section 5 and the series. With the closing of this fifth and final part, we now have arrived on the end of our lengthy, quiet exploration of how guys within the Middle Ages sought to impress ladies no longer by means of dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, however, through careful conformity, repeated effort, and participation in sluggish relocating social constructions, from the rhythms of the agricultural year to the procedures of guild legislation, from modest letters and carved tokens to the studying of banns and the alternate of property. Every step was once marked by way of deliberation, group oversight, and patient intention. The medieval world didn't hurry, and neither did its process to courtship. In this smooth percent, one finds not emotional grandeur, however continuity, steadiness, and a calm, enduring appreciate for tradition. You may now enable your thoughts to float softly, slowly into the quieter corners of the previous, where even the smallest gesture, repeated over time, would end up a statement of putting up with presence.